The old Don signed the paper with a hand that could barely hold the pen, and when the lawyer read it aloud to the family gathered around the deathbed, the room went so quiet you could hear the Atlantic throwing itself against the cliffs below. Everything, the houses, the money, the whole machine that had run half the coast for 40 years, all of it left not to his son, not to his blood, but to the fat, quiet woman who had dusted his shelves and warmed his broth for 6 years. The housekeeper. His family looked at her the way wolves look at a wounded thing that's somehow standing in the good spot. And the dying man, with the last clear breath he had, looked past all of them to her and said, "They'll come for you tonight. Let them. You're the only one in this house I trust to win." The fog came in off the Atlantic that autumn and sat on the cliffs of Newport for days at a time, so thick you couldn't see the water you could hear. And it wrapped the Batali estate, 40 rooms of coral-cold marble and old money, like a held breath. Nora Bennett had kept that house for 6 years. She was the housekeeper, and before dawn every day she moved through the great silent rooms in soft shoes, opening curtains onto gray, laying fires, carrying trays, wiping the sea salt film off windows that looked out on nothing but weather. She was 34 and built broad and soft, a size 22 in a house where everyone else was carved thin and hard. And the family who owned the place had long ago filed her under the same heading as the furniture she polished: present useful, unseen. They said things in front of her they'd never say in front of a person, because they had decided, without ever deciding it, that she wasn't one. She had not always been a housekeeper. That was the part none of them knew. 9 years ago, there had been a life, a father, Thomas Bennett, who ran an honest import business on the Providence docks, a good man with a good ledger and a bad habit of not paying the right people. Cesare Bruno had wanted the waterfront Thomas held, so Bruno had done what Bruno did, a shipment that turned out to hold something it shouldn't, a customs seal that pointed the wrong way, a headline, a seizure, a ruin. Thomas Bennett lost everything he'd built and died the winter after of a heart that had simply been asked to hold too much, leaving a sick widow and a daughter with nothing but a name that now opened no doors. So the daughter had gone looking for honest work, and honest work for a fallen woman with no references was a mop and a bucket, and that was how Nora Bennett came to keep house for a mob boss named Aldo Vitale, Cesare Bruno's oldest and coldest enemy, without either of them knowing at first the thread that tied them. Aldo had found out eventually. Old men who are dying have time to be curious. He'd learned who her father was and what Bruno had done to him, and something behind his ruined eyes had gone very still and very interested, and he'd started in his last year, talking to the housekeeper more than he talked to his own family. Because the family was rot, and Aldo Vitale knew it. His nephew Marco wanted the empire and counted the days out loud. His late brother's daughter, a glittering cold thing named Camilla Ashford, who'd married a Vitale and buried him and stayed, wanted a throne and had a list of who she'd remove to get one. His lawyer, Gerald Thorne, drew up documents with a smile that never reached his eyes and a loyalty that went to the highest bidder, and his most trusted underboss, Renzo Fontana, the man who sat with him on the long nights, who brought him the hand-rolled cigars he could no longer smoke and just held for the smell of them. Renzo, who wept at the right moments, was the worst snake of all, though the old man only suspected it, never quite proved it before the end. There was only one person in the whole house of 40 rooms who had never once asked Aldo Vitale for anything, who brought him broth because he needed it, not because a will was pending, who talked to him about the sea and the fog and her dead father, and never, not once, about the money. So the old Don did the last cold, brilliant thing of a cold, brilliant life. He looked at his rotten family and his compromised organization and his one honest servant with a righteous reason to want his enemy dead, and he made his choice. He left her the empire. The reading was in the great room with the fog pressing on the tall windows and the family arranged around the deathbed like a painting of grief that no one felt. Gerald Thorne read it in a flat voice, and every clause landed like a stone dropped in a well. The houses, to Nora Bennett. The accounts, to Nora Bennett. The whole of the Vitale interests, the legitimate and the not, the machine that had run the coast for 40 years, to Nora Bennett, entire and unencumbered, effective at the moment of death. The silence when Gerald stopped reading was the loudest thing Nora had ever heard. "That's not possible," Marco said, into it. He wasn't in his mind. Gerald. Tell them he wasn't in his. He was assessed by 3 physicians, Gerald said tonelessly, because Gerald had been paid to make it airtight, and Gerald did airtight work, no matter who it hurt. It will hold. And that was when Nora felt it. The temperature of the room turning, all those thin, hard faces swiveling toward her at once, the calculation running behind every set of eyes. She was not furniture anymore. She was the good spot, and she was standing in it, and she was wounded, and they were wolves. The dying man's hand found her wrist. His grip was almost nothing now, but his eyes, when she leaned down, were perfectly clear. "They'll come for you tonight," Aldo Vitale said, so quietly only she could hear. "Let them. You know this house better than any of them. You've cleaned every inch of it. You know every lock, every stair, every place a man can hide, and every place he can't. They think that makes you a servant." The ghost of something crossed his ruined face. "It makes you the only one who could ever really hold it. I didn't give you a gift, girl. I gave you a war, because you're the only one in my blood, or out of it, I'd trust to win it. Finish what I couldn't. You know who I mean." Cesare Bruno, she thought. "You mean Cesare Bruno," she thought. "You mean Cesare Bruno." Aldo Vitale died an hour later, with the fog against the glass, and the war began before his body was cold. The one person who didn't look at her like a wolf was the dead man's son. Damiano Vitale had stood at the foot of his father's bed through the whole reading, with his face like the cliffs, weathered, unmoving, giving the sea nothing. He was the rightful heir. Everyone in that room, including Nora, had assumed the empire would go to him. He'd been raised to it, bled for it, was feared across the coast in his own right, as the coldest of all the old man's instruments. By every law of blood and custom, his father had just robbed him in front of the whole family and handed his birthright to the woman who made his bed. And Damiano Vitale looked at the will, and looked at his weeping, calculating cousins, and looked at Nora, and did the one thing none of them expected. He crossed the room, past all of them, and stood beside her. "My father was the most careful man I ever knew," he said to the room, at conversational volume, and the room went silent the way rooms did around him. "He didn't lose his mind. He weighed every one of you, and he weighed her, and he made a choice. He let that sit. I trusted his judgment while he was alive. I'm not going to insult him by doubting it an hour after he's dead. The house belongs to Miss Bennett. Anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with me." Marco laughed. "Ugly. You'd hand it to the maid. Your own father spat on you, and you'll just—" "He didn't spit on me," Damiano said, and something in his voice made Marco stop. "He gave me something better than a throne. He gave me a reason to find out who in this family would draw a knife over a will before the body was cold." He looked slowly around the room, and one by one the thin, hard faces found somewhere else to look. "Keep talking, Marco. You're doing my father's work for him. You're showing me exactly who you are." Later, when the family had scattered to their phones and their scheming, Damiano found Nora alone in the kitchen, the one room in the house that had ever felt like hers, making tea because her hands needed something to do. "You could have taken it," she said, without turning. "By blood, it's yours. Nobody would have blinked if you'd broken the will. Half of them would have thanked you. My father didn't do things by accident." He leaned in the doorway watching her. "He left it to you for a reason, and I've spent my whole life learning to trust his reasons even when I hated them. So the question isn't whether you keep it. You keep it. The question is whether you understand what you're holding." His eyes were steady. "That house out there isn't marble and money. It's a target the size of a mansion, and my father just painted your name on it. Marco will move on you inside a week. Renzo before that, and quieter, and behind them, using them, feeding the fire, the man my father spent 30 years fighting and never beat. He paused. Cesare Bruno, who I understand you have your own history with. Nora set down the kettle and turned to face him. He killed my father, she said. Then it seems, Damiano said slowly, that my father left the empire to the one person in the world with more reason to burn Cesare Bruno down than I have. That wasn't charity. That was a weapon, aimed and handed over. Something that was almost respect moved across his hard face. I don't want the throne, Nora. I never wanted to be my father, but I want Bruno gone more than I want to breathe. And my father just made the housekeeper the sharpest blade in this house to do it with. So here's what I'm offering. Not protection. You'd throw that back at me. I can see it in your face. A partnership. You hold the empire. I hold the line. And together we finish the war he died fighting. Nora Bennett looked at the son who'd been robbed of his birthright and had crossed a room to stand beside the thief. Partners, she said. And then, because she was who she was, but I run the house. I've run it for 6 years. I just do it from the front rooms now. For the first time since his father took ill, Damiano Vitale almost smiled. They tried to dress her for it, and she wouldn't have it, and that was the first thing that told the family the maid was gone, and something else was standing in her shoes. A stylist named Fabian Cross was sent up from the city to make the new head of the Vitale Empire presentable, and he circled her twice with pursed lips before he began pulling long, dark, shapeless things off a rack, murmuring about verticals, about the mercy of a column, about how with her figure the entire art was to minimize and lengthen, and never let the eye come to rest. You're dressing her to disappear into the paneling. Damiano had come in without a sound and pushed the rack aside with the flat of his hand, slow and final. She's about to sit at the head of my father's table and stare down every wolf on this coast. Put her in an apology and you've lost the room before she opens her mouth. Out. Fabian fled. Damiano turned. What do you want to wear? Nobody had asked her that in 9 years of soft shoes and gray mornings. She had to look away for a second. Crimson, she said. Not wine, not a whisper. The loud red, the arterial red. The color that means somebody's finally paying attention. Heavy silk, cut to hold its own line. Nothing that hides in the folds. Bare arms. She lifted her chin. For 6 years I moved through that house trying to take up as little of it as I could, so no one would remember I was there. That woman is dead. Let every one of them see exactly how much of me there is, standing in the middle of the room they thought was theirs. A woman they can't stop staring at is a woman they forget to guard against. Enzo Marchetti, the old Don's enforcer, who had spent the reading deciding whether to follow a housekeeper or a corpse's wish, took his hands out of his pockets. She learned things about Damiano in the hard weeks that followed, and the long nights the war kept them both awake. She learned the coldest of the old Don's sons couldn't sleep and walked the cliff path in the fog at 2 in the morning and read when he read at all. About shipwrecks, the ones where a good captain made one wrong call in the dark and lost everything. She learned he'd been 16 when he watched his older brother die in a car meant for their father, and that he'd spent his whole life becoming a thing that death had to work harder to reach. She learned he pressed his thumb to an old scar along his jaw when something got past his guard and that he did it once, watching her take the head of a table full of men who hated her and blamed the cold off the water. They talk about your father like he was a force of nature, she said to him one night, both of them on the cliff terrace with the fog erasing the sea. And you the same. Why do the Vitali men make people afraid like that? Because we learned early that fear is cheaper than force, he said, watching the gray. Loud men, cruel men. They're just frightened men who haven't been caught yet. The trick my father taught me is to be exact. Say a thing once, mean the whole of it, and let the other man's imagination do the rest of your work for nothing. He was quiet a moment. It's a way of turning yourself into a story until there's no man left inside it. He died that way. A legend in a bed, surrounded by people counting his money, And the only one who ever just brought him soup was the woman he'd never once looked at as a person until the end. He turned to her. He saw it too late. I'd rather not. Nora didn't answer that. She didn't have to. The fog held them both and said nothing, and something crossed between them that neither of them named. The first blow was hers, and she never once let it be called anything else. The family's war ran on money and lawyers, and Marco and Gerald had spent a week trying to freeze the estate, tie the will in probate, choke Nora out before she could take real hold. But the war behind the war, the one that mattered, was Cesare Bruno, who had been feeding Marco's ambition and Renzo's treachery for months, patient as rot, waiting for the old Don to die so the Vitale Empire would tear itself apart and he could walk in and take the coast at last. And Nora Bennett knew something none of them did. She knew the house. She'd cleaned every inch of it for 6 years. She knew which rooms she'd never been allowed to enter, which safe behind which painting was the real one, and which was the decoy for burglars which floorboard in the old Don's study lifted, because she was the one who waxed it. And she knew, because she dusted it 1,000 times without knowing what it was, that Aldo Vitale had kept a single locked box behind the seascape in his study that no one but Aldo ever touched, and that he'd looked at it once in his last week and told her, when it's time, the house will show you where I kept my teeth. She went and got it herself, alone, at 3 in the morning, because a housekeeper knows how to move through a house unheard. Inside was the old Don's insurance, 40 years of it, proof and ledgers and photographs and one careful handwritten account that Cesare Bruno laundered his fortune through a foundation and a string of art sales, moving dirty millions as overvalued paintings sold to shells he controlled. And underneath all of it, in her father's own file, the thing Aldo had kept for her without ever saying so, the proof that the custom seizure that destroyed Thomas Bennett had been arranged, paid for, and signed off by Cesare Bruno's own hand. He kept it for me, Nora said, laying it on the table in front of Damiano and Enzo, her voice steady and terrible. Your father. He had the thing that could hang Bruno for 9 years, and he sat on it. Because a war needs to be fought at the right hour, by the right hand. And he left me the house so I'd find it, and the empire so I'd have the reach to use it. She looked up. We don't need a witness. We have his own books, and my father's file, and 40 years of the old man's teeth. We need a federal prosecutor and one reporter who isn't afraid of a patron of the arts. And then we open the box in daylight, and we let the whole coast watch it happen. Enzo looked at the file. He looked at Damiano. He looked at the housekeeper who'd found in one night what the family's lawyers couldn't in a week. Boss, he said, and it was the first time he'd called her that. Your father chose right. She did it herself, because that was the deal, always. She walked into a U.S. attorney's office in loud crimson with her spine like a mast and laid 40 years of a dead man's teeth on the desk. And afterward she stood at a window beside a reporter who'd wanted Cesare Bruno for a decade and said quietly, ask him to explain the paintings. Ask him what a foundation needs with 100 canvases nobody's ever seen. Watch a patron of the arts run out of patrons. 3 weeks later, the story broke. The accounts froze, and $90 million of Cesare Bruno's laundry stopped moving and had to surface, in the open, in daylight, where a careful old man was forced at last to reach for it with his own bare hand. They came for her on a Sunday, in the fog, in the house, because the family had decided the direct way was the only way left. She felt it before she understood it, a wrongness in a house she knew in the dark with her eyes shut. There was a man on the servants' stair, the narrow back stair the family never used and never thought about, still in the way the living are never still, empty hands loose and ready. Later, Enzo would tell her his name was Cain, and that he'd done this 11 times and buried 11 people and never once been seen leaving. He wasn't there for Nora. He was there because at midnight Damiano was crossing the dark house alone to the study. Alone, because the only man who knew he'd be there without his crew was Renzo Fontana. Cain didn't know the house. That was his mistake. And it was the last one he made, because the housekeeper knew it better than she knew her own hands. She didn't run. She led him. Let him hear her. let him follow, drew him off the servant's stair and into the long gallery, where she knew the runner rug slid on the old waxed floor she'd polished 1,000 times, and where the wrought iron fire tools stood by the cold hearth exactly where she'd set them that morning. He came fast on the treacherous floor, and his feet went out from under him on the rug. And Nora Bennett took the heavy iron poker off the stand two-handed and swung it with 6 years of hauling and scrubbing and hauling built into her shoulders. Her arms were strong. She'd been carrying this whole house for 6 years, and every one of them had called her soft. Damiano came out of the study into a nightmare. A man down on the gallery floor, and Nora standing over him, crimson gone dark down the front, the poker still in her fist, breathing hard and perfectly, terribly steady. She'd chosen this. She did not look away from what she'd done, because looking away would have made it a thing that happened to her, and she was done forever with the first kind. What happened to Cain in the next minute was fast and quiet and final, and she watched all of it, because she'd walked into this world with clear eyes and would not start closing them now. Then Damiano's hands were on her face and they were shaking, the coldest son of the coldest house hands going like a boy's. Checking her arms, her throat, saying her name low once, the way you say a thing to be sure the floor still holds. He wasn't sent for me. Nora got out. Damiano. He was waiting for you. And only 3 people knew you'd cross to the study alone tonight. I know. It's Renzo. I know. His forehead dropped to hers and he shut his eyes. I've known for a week. I needed him to move so I'd have him clean. And I let him move, and he moved at you, and his voice fractured, all the exactness gone out of it. I put myself out as bait in my father's own house, and he sent a knife at the one person left in it that I. He stopped. Tell me to stop. Right now, and I'll put you and your mother somewhere he can never reach, and you'll never have to see any of us again. Nora took 2 fistfuls of his collar and pulled him down and kissed him. It was not gentle, and it was not a beginning. It was a woman taking a thing the whole world had spent 34 years insisting she had no permission to want, and his hand came up into her hair and he made a low broken sound against her mouth, like a man setting down a weight so old he'd forgotten it had ends. No, she said against his lips. We finish it. Together, and you stop deciding what I can walk through. Your father already decided I could walk through anything, and he was right. She pulled back to look at him. I didn't inherit a house. I inherited his war, and I'm going to win it standing up next to you. Yes, Damiano said, wrecked. God help every one of them. Yes, the reckoning came for Cesare Bruno on a gray afternoon in the great room of the Vitale estate itself, because Nora Bennett had decided the war her father in spirit died fighting would end in the house he left her, with the fog against the glass exactly where it began. Renzo Fontana was already in a chair when Nora walked in beside Damiano. He'd been brought. He was still hunting for the easy smile that had carried him through 8 years at the old Don's side, and it was nowhere to be found. Boss, he said, to Damiano out of habit, and then, sickly, to Nora. Boss, whatever they've told you. You sat with my father every Sunday of his dying, Damiano said, in the flat, even voice his father had taught him. You brought him the cigars he couldn't smoke and held them so the room would smell of them. And he wept once out of gratitude, and I saw it. And the whole time you were Cesare Bruno's man, feeding him the family from the inside, waiting for the old man to die so you could hand Bruno the house. He nodded, slow. The cigars are the part I keep turning over. That you'd bring a dying man that kindness while you sold his empire out from under him. That's a specific kind of cold. Even I don't have it. Renzo stopped looking for the smile. Nora set the old Don's file on the great table and opened it herself. Then she did the thing she'd spent 6 years being forbidden to do in that room. She sat down at the head of the table in the old Don's own chair and took up exactly as much of it as she pleased, and looked a 70-year-old killer in the eye, until he had no choice but to look back at the housekeeper he'd never once seen. You destroyed my father on the Providence docks 9 years ago, she said. You put contraband under his seal and let a headline finish him, and you went to a gala the same month and gave a speech about honest trade. I have the paper you signed. Aldo Vitale kept it for 9 years, waiting for the right hand to hold it. It turned out to be mine. She turned a page. Every clean dollar you've laundered through your foundation froze the week a housekeeper opened a box behind a painting. Renzo signed his cooperation this morning. He sold you to save himself, the way he'd sell anyone. And the customs man who stamped my father's ruin retired scared. And this week he decided he'd rather talk than sink with you. She looked up. You spent 40 years being careful, Cesare, and you were beaten by an old man's last honest choice and a woman who dusted the room you're standing in. That's the joke my father died laughing at. He knew. He always knew it would be you who never saw her coming. Cesare Bruno looked at Renzo. Renzo looked at the floor, and Nora Bennett watched a careful old man understand in real time in the house of the enemy who'd finally beaten him from the grave, that he'd been taken apart by the two people he'd been far too important to see. A dead rival's overlooked son and a housekeeper he'd never known had a father's name to avenge. "You want me to beg?" Cesare said. "No," Nora said. "I want you awake. Every second of it." My father wasn't given awake. He was given a headline and a slow year and a heart that gave out in the dark. I just want you to understand all the way to the end that the empire you spent your life trying to swallow is the one that finally ate you, and that it was handed to a housekeeper on purpose by a better man than you, precisely because he knew it would be your last thought. Salvatore Conti, the old consigliere who had served Aldo Vitale for 40 years and had doubted the housekeeper twice in the first hard days, rose slowly from his chair by the fire and said nothing, and inclined his head to the woman in the old Don's chair, and the standing was the whole coronation. The indictment ran to 22 counts. The Bruno Foundation collapsed. The paintings went to the government's evidence lockers, and Nora, who now held an empire, gave one thing away for free that she'd never sell. She had the customs file that cleared her father's name entered into the public record, so that Thomas Bennett, 9 years dead, was unruined at last, and a small item ran in the Providence paper that Margaret Bennett cut out and framed. Renzo Fontana took his deal, and his 11 years and a name no one on that coast will say aloud at a table again. Marco Vitale, exposed as Bruno's creature, was stripped of everything and put out of the family for good. Gerald Thorne, who'd made the will airtight for money, discovered the will he'd bulletproofed had bulletproofed the housekeeper, and slunk off to smaller and dirtier work. Camilla Ashford married a fortune in Monaco and stopped returning the coast's calls, which is what old money does instead of a verdict. Margaret Bennett got the care she needed on the sea. Her husband's name was finally clean beside and cried, and told everyone within reach that her daughter had always been the strong one. The family had just been too busy surviving to notice. Nora and Damiano married the next spring, on the cliff terrace, with the fog burned off for once and the Atlantic bright and hard below. She wore crimson. Everyone understood. She kept the house, and the empire, and her own name, and ran all three from the front rooms now. And when the coldest son of the coldest house said his vows in that even voice that never had to rise, he promised to be exact about her every day he was breathing. And every hard man on that terrace went still, because they knew precisely what exact meant when a Vitale said it. And they understood that the housekeeper in red was no longer anyone on that coast could afford to walk past. For 6 years they said everything in front of her because they were certain a heavy, quiet woman with a dust cloth wasn't really in the room. That's the flaw in the person you decide doesn't count. You let her clean the room where you keep your secrets. You let her learn every lock and every stair and every place a thing can be hidden. And a dying man who spent his whole life reading people reads her too, and leaves the whole world to the one set of hands nobody thought to watch. So be careful who you let keep your house. She knows where everything is, including, when the hour comes, exactly where you left yourself unguarded. If her reckoning gave you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who's done watching heroines wait to be saved, and subscribe for the next story. Then tell me down in the comments, who should she come for next?